It is December 8th. It is 11:15 p.m. It is less than an hour until deck submissions are due for Grand Prix 4th Street, and I think I have my anti-persist plan figured out. Persist is my big deck on the big deck on my radar of either you gotta beat them, join them. I think a lot of people are going to avoid bringing Persist out of fear that they're going to get hated out, and I think the people who do bring Persist are going to be very happy with themselves because I think a lot of the Persist hate that people are gravitating to and latching onto are really bad. The big name of the game as far as bad Persist hate that I think a lot of people are going to be gravitating towards is Solemn Graveyard. The more I've thought about Solemn Graveyard, the more I've been looking at it. I know I recommended it in my sideboard guide. I know it's the big thing everyone's looking at, and to be quite honest, I might have been wrong to even include it in the sideboard guide. I think this card is relevant against certain matchups. I think polymorph decks are going to be something that is a reasonable, viable angle to approach the format from, and I think Solemn Graveyard is very good against those decks. I think slower decks relying on Raise Rampage or Heroes Never Die do get punished by Solemn Graveyard. I think decks relying on Unite the Clans are going to get punished by Solemn Graveyard. Card Shark will get punished by Solemn Graveyard. Garen gets punished by Solemn Graveyard. There's a lot of things to like about Solemn Graveyard in this field, but I think if you are using it as your crutch against Persist, you are going to have a bad time. Because in spite of everything that Solemn Graveyard does against that deck, it shuts off Unite the Clans, Ozon's Blessing, and Raise Rampage. It disables Persist from functioning as a mechanic. In spite of all of that, it is a 2-mana permanent that dies to the removal that is so good it can get main decked in Persist, Event Horizon. Event Horizon is trivial for Persist to include, which just means that Solemn Graveyard sits in play as a once you remove this I die piece, which is, still relevant. It does buy time, but I think Persist can also just pop off really quickly, pop off turn 3 or turn 4, which doesn't give you a lot of time to find your Solemn Graveyard, meaning you kind of have to mulligan hard for it, and that might sacrifice your ability to not die to them just putting creatures in play and swinging sideways with their creatures, because their creatures are actually really solid for just a decent combo deck. They can absolutely just turn sideways and kill you with a bunch of 2-power creatures. And then, stack everything to Seductive Gorgon to just do a bunch of damage over the top. So, with that in mind, my concern going into this tournament was there probably won't be a lot of Persist players, but the people who are on Persist are going to probably do really well. Because the pieces people are bringing in with the intent of beating Persist are not particularly great against that matchup. With that in mind, I started thinking about what is a deck that I can bring that fights the field and has a good matchup into Persist. And that answer was 8 exile-based removal spell, 9 recursion piece, white-black minion. Let's start with the creature base. Diabolical Minion is the name of the game. We are trying to get Diabolical Minion down for relatively cheap, pick off our opponent's permanents, interact with our opponent, develop our board, and every time we cast almost any spell in our deck, we are going to gain 1 and deal 1 to our opponent. That is just going to buy us time against more aggressive decks and apply a lot of meaningful pressure against combo and slower decks. Alongside Diabolical Minion, we have 4 copies of Granite Harbinger as our other 1-drop. Harbinger is a cheap 1-drop that triggers Minion because it is an artifact creature, while also just being a very solid, sticky blocker that also can just chip in for reliable damage turn after turn by being a flyer. I did entertain playing a one of Nightmare of some other variety, but the more I was looking at it, the best options were mono black and largely depended on making our opponent discard cards, which is not something I love to do against something like Persist, and I also think is just not super well positioned if it's your only way of making your opponent discard cards. I think the Rack is a real deck that can be showing up in the tournament and doing well with some success, and I think if you're all in on discard, running those cards is great. But I think I particularly don't care for discard. I looked at running some of the 1 mana make an opponent discard enchantments and really didn't like any of them here. So with that in mind, I have foregone I have passed over those other nightmares, and I'm just playing the 4 of Granite Harbinger. They're good, they're sticky, they're annoying, they block really well, they attack pretty well. Um, they're just everything I need right now. Finax's Confidant is one of our 2 drops, just a solid card draw engine. We have no black spells that cost more than 2 in our main deck, and only 1 that costs 3 in our sideboard. So it's very easy for us to have Devotion of 2 or 3 to make our 1 or 2 mana black spells cantrip at the cost of some life, but that life loss gets mitigated by Diabolical Minion. Also, drawing us cards and losing us life is Smirk, Dark Hands Favored, very good in conjunction with Confidant as it contributes to Devotion on its own. Is a 2/3 that blocks really well into a lot of the solid, cheap creatures in the format. When it enters, we'll get to add the top 2 cards of our library to our evil plan. That probably won't matter too much, but if we start flooding out, that is a relevant bit of text. And the casting second spell each turn to draw a card and lose 2 life is just more good card flow options. Our last 2-drop is our way of pushing damage when we need to and padding our own life total, Voidmist Prodigy. Oftentimes we are just going to be using this as a 2 mana deal 3 gain 3 and just ship this straight to the graveyard. Because we have 9 recursive pieces, this can be a reliable way to push damage over time and really put our foot on the pedal. The life gain makes this a phenomenal piece against something like Burn, where they're just kind of trying to put our life total 0. This buys us time, especially in conjunction with Minion, essentially just ratcheting these numbers up from 3 to 4, or like every copy of Minion adding 1 to those loss of life and gain of life numbers in the text box can be really relevant. And with our recursive pieces, again, this going straight to the graveyard can become a boon where we can just keep bringing it out to shoot our opponent over and over. Topping off our curve is Yeji Resplendent Idol. When looking at recursive pieces, I looked for a while at a 3-mana enchantment called Half-Heart's Claim that I was really fond of and really hoping could be playable in this format, but I think Solemn Graveyard is really awkward for it. I think it's really poorly positioned against Persist, and I think the best thing to do as a 3-mana recursive engine is Yeji because of 2 factors. The first is that she exiles a permanent card from our graveyard, and makes a token that's a copy of it. That gets around Solemn Graveyard, which makes Yeji a very solid way to play around the things people are playing around, or are like bringing around to get into, recursive matchups. Yeji being able to counteract Solemn Graveyard and not care about Solemn Graveyard is a real bit of relevant text. It means that she's not as infinitely loopable, but that's fine. We're not trying to go infinite, we're trying to just kill our opponents. The second thing that's really important here is Yeji does something that very little other recursion in the format does, which is bring back permanence. This is relevant because we've got 6 fetch lands, 4 new divides to redevelop cityscapes, so that can really get us a lot of consistent mana development. We have 3 dormant temples, so we can just start drawing extra cards in the mid to late game. And going into our removal suite, our cheapest removal spell that is going to be good into Persist is Dishonor, which is going to exile one of our opponent's creatures when it dies, while also giving it -1/-2. Importantly, this kills everything out of Persist on a baseline, and kills almost everything out of Persist when it gets a +1/+1 counter, with only really the Persist creatures themselves surviving as 2/1s. This is really, really big for something like Dishonor. Dishonor being just this cheap removal spell you can play early against Persist without it just fueling their raise rampages makes it so, so good into that deck in particular. And when you have these 3 Yejis, and next card we'll get into, 4 Heroes Never Dies, being able to bring Dishonor back, that makes this a repeatable removal spell that just offers so much game into that matchup without it being dead against other decks, because plenty of decks are running cheap creatures with low toughness. Plenty of decks are looking to be more aggressive, and Dishonor is really good against very aggro slanted creatures. This kills a Rogue's Palace Card Shark. Not sure if that's necessarily the thing you want to be dishonoring there, but it kills a Rogue's Palace Card Shark. It shrinks a whole lot of things down to like nothing in a matter of seconds. And again, with the engine of Yeji, Dishonor becomes even more reliable. Moving into instance, we have Heroes Never Die, which is primarily added because it is more ways to bring back Dishonor. This is an instant speed way to get Dishonor into play. If we have one in our graveyard, getting Dishonor into play at instant speed means we can disrupt a persist loop at instant speed with Heroes Never Die, and we can also use this as more Voidmist Prodigies to deal damage. We could use this with Smirk to get more cards in the Evil Plan and get Smirk back in play, and we even gain 2 life if we put Smirk back in play. You can get Phoenix's Confidant back in play. We can get Harbinger, Diabolical Minion. Any of their creatures that are really important can come back into play, and we kind of do like having all of our creatures in play. So Heroes Never Die is going to be very likely to have a lot of relevant text in a lot of matchups, with just the caveat that it is not amazing against Solemn Graveyard. We also have 4 copies of Succumb to History, just more exile-based removal. This is going to also pick off almost anything out of the Persist deck besides an Opal Eye Caretaker with 2 counters on it, which is going to be a pretty big ask. Making this a pretty solid piece positioned against those decks. I looked at Fatal Flaw for a little bit. I looked at having 4 copies of Twilight Ambush in the main deck for a little bit, but I think Succumb to History is just so well positioned. If you can have the 2 mana, it is just going to pick off any creature. There is the argument I'm in white. Maybe I should just have these 4 Event Horizons in the main deck and have Succumb as like sideboard tech. But I think because of us being a Diabolical Minion plan, and being such a heavy black slant, I wanted to not like go too heavy on a bunch of white spells that makes Minion look worse, that makes Phoenix's Confidant look worse. And I think really these cards are so important to the strategy that Succumb just gets a little bit of the extra bump here. Though, of course, as we'll get to later, this Horizons don't just fail to make the deck. And then finally, 2 copies of the Twilight Ambush. I don't love destroy-based removal in this format, but I do think that having 1 mana interaction is still really important, especially instant speed interaction, and so Twilight Ambush does still get the nod there. We do have 2 more copies in the sideboard. There are still a lot of aggressive strategies that Twilight Ambush does really well against. If anybody else is on Diabolical Minion, Ambush is really good against Minion decks. So, a lot of relevance to have with Twilight Ambush, and if there are matchups where we run into needing more than that, we have 2 in the sideboard as well. Finally, Raise Rampage was a card I started off on a 4 of and have gradually whittled down to a 2 of. The more I look at Raise Rampage, the more I'm worried that this is the card in our deck that suffers the most against Solemn Graveyard. For a while, I was running this pure white-black, and accepting that like Raise was just going to be a dead draw against Solemn Graveyard, because I'm never really caring about removing Solemn Graveyard. I think this deck just has better things to be doing than picking off a 2-mana artifact. So I kind of accepted that like Raise would be a dead card that I'd either have to sideboard out or just, accept that like it'll just be occasional burst damage with Voidmist Prodigy, or like get back a Phoenix's Confidant or a Diabolical Minion or something. And I think that is all still relevant enough for Raise to be good. I think Voidmist Prodigy alone wants to see a couple copies of Raise Rampage, because otherwise, when Raise can be 1 mana, deal 3, gain 3, draw another 1 mana, deal 3, gain 3, of course you're going to want it alongside Voidmist Prodigy. But the concession that I made to this potentially being a dead draw in cases where our opponents are going to have ways to sort of stop Raise from being relevant is that there is a single mountain in our mana base, so Rampage can actually be castable. I really wasn't sure about this for a little while, but I think this is just going to be the best case for this card, of having the 1 mountain, having the way to have Rampage get to give our creatures +1/+0 haste is relevant, is going to come up maybe one of our games across the GP. That's my prediction. I think Rampage will be relevant in a single game across the GP. At least one. Then finally, 23 lands. I was unsure how many lands to be on for a while, but I think 23 has felt like a very comfortable place to be. We have 3 of Dormant Temple and Gloomcover Steppe. Dormant Temple, solid pain land that we can cash in when we start to flood out a little bit to draw a card. And with Yeji being able to potentially bring it back, we can cash it in again to draw another card. Gloomcover to Steppe. I know people are leaning towards the white-black fast land from Streets of the River Cities, Secrets of the River Cities, rather. But I think Gloomcover Steppe, I feel, just is a little bit better. There are more ways of me having basic plains or basic swamps. I'm not always going to be getting these on turn 1, 2, or 3, and I think having the Gloomcover Steppes be untapped in a longer game is relevant, since we are trying to kind of grind our opponents out a little bit, especially something like the Persist matchup, where, having the untapped mana on the first few turns is important, but so is being able to have our lands come in untapped later on because of something like Yeji. We also have one of Gates to the Underworld. Gates is one of 3 lands that's just always going to be tapped. Functionally always going to be tapped. This was largely a concession to the aggro decks that I think are going to be running around the format. I think having a way for a land to just be 3/4 lifelinking creature is going to be very relevant in a handful of matchups, and having that ability to have a creature that dodges sorcery speed removal, lurks in our mana base, is going to be very relevant in a handful of matchups. Notably, also, Gates to the Underworld does something that most creatures in this format don't do, which is it dodges Event Horizon. So against decks that are leaning on white removal to remove creatures, Gates to the Underworld gets through. It is also uncounterable, which is really important. Finally, we have 4 of New Divide and 2 of Redeveloped Cityscape. I was on 1 Cityscape for a while and 1 more basic land, but I think where I've ultimately been happiest is with 2 of Cityscape, being able to just improve mulligans significantly, accepting that Cityscape is going to sometimes mean we have a tapped land in our curve at some point, slowing down our ability to play multiple spells in the early game. But I think that is okay, because being able to mulligan more consistently and have more consistent, reliable opening hands is important enough to have the second Redeveloped Cityscape. So this, the 3 lands that are always going to enter tapped, the Cityscape lands that they get, and then the Gates to the Underworld, and then New Divide can enter tapped if we don't need it immediately, but if we have the life to pay, if we're not worried about paying the life, or we just need the immediacy, this is just the best fetch land in the format. And then we are on 7 swamps, 2 plains, 1 mountain. 2 plains because, we do have these 2 really important white spells, but they are 2 white spells in the main deck, and we only really have 1 more in the sideboard, so we're not super deep on white spells, but we still have plenty of other white sources kicking around with our 7 dual lands, so it's not like we're going to be incapable of casting Yeji or Heroes Never Die, and, the 2 planes are still nice to be able to multicast, a couple copies of Heroes, or a couple, like Yeji into Heroes Never Die, or something like that. And as far as our mana base goes, as far as our curve goes, we do have a handful of, 1 mana spells that planes can't really cast, Diabolical Minion, Dishonor, Twilight Ambush, Raise all kind of are a little awkward there, but otherwise, Granite Harbinger can be cast off of planes, Confidant can be cast off of planes, Void Mist Prodigy can, Succumb to History can. The only card beyond 1 mana that's really awkward for the planes is Smirk, and I think that's just a fine concession to make to be more consistently able to cast Heroes Never Die in Yeji. And then finally, as I mentioned, the 1 mountain is just a concession to make Raise Rampage sometimes be relevant outside of being used as Raise. Moving on to the sideboard, I've talked a little bit about our instants. We have the 4 Event Horizon, we have the 2 of Twilight Ambush. The 2 more Twilight Ambush is for aggressive matchups, where we feel like we just want more of these cheap removal spells that pick off smaller creatures. Event Horizon is going to be our sort of catch-all against any non-land permanent that we feel like might be a problem. This card is just so good that, I think any white deck not running 3 to 4 in their 75 is going to probably regret it a little bit. They're probably going to want to have a full play set. And in this case, there are cards that probably have slipped my mind that having an answer to will be nice and important to have access to. So, Event Horizon does get to do a lot of work there, and does get to leverage the low general mana values of things in the format. And then otherwise, we have 9 sorceries, and they're all dedicated to taking care of things that have not hit the board. We have 2 copies of Transgress Identity. This is going to be particularly good in an open deck list format like a GP. If there are particular cards that we are worried about our opponent having, we can just kind of pick those off in our opponent's hand. If we have a minion in play and we just need a cantrip, we can also just name a terrible card we know our opponent isn't on, and then cantrip to get more cards to cast with Diabolical Minion, or to draw a card, to get closer to drawing a card with Smirk, or to get closer to amping it up with Yeji. There's just a lot of value to be had in Transgress Identity. The only reason this isn't in the main deck is because the main deck is already really tight, and I don't love this in the matchups I'm most worried about. I don't think this is a very good card into Persist. I don't think it's a very good card into a lot of the aggro matchups, but anything that's trying to go a little slower, Identity is going to be great against. 4 of Memory Hostage is my biggest answer into Storm. I think Storm is going to be a very real archetype people are looking to bring, and I don't think this deck does too great against Storm in the main deck. I think this deck struggles a lot with Storm because a lot of our deck is trying to beat other creature decks, and Storm is not a creature deck. Unless they're on the build that finishes on Laboratory Maniac, and even then that deck has ways of getting around interaction with Laboratory Maniac by drawing a card without passing priority. So with that in mind, Memory Hostage is our way to say, no, thank you, don't get the Storm, please. If we can get to Memory Hostage before they can pop off, we can Memory Hostage and just sort of pick the biggest problem out of our opponent's deck and take all of those away from them. Memory Hostage also does have some play against Persist combo, against some like slower mid-range decks. I think one of the big things that is true of mid-range decks that is on my radar is I do not think this deck has a particularly amazing matchup into decks trying to cheat Tyrant of Tributes into play. Memory Hostage really is one of our best ways of dealing with Tyrant of Tributes. So we just, get that out of the equation. The same is true for Azimuth. I think Polymorph is a matchup that could be a little scary. Having the instant speed interaction with Succumb to History with Twilight Ambush does help keep an Azimuth from getting cheated into play. But it's a very real concern. So Memory Hostage is going to be our sort of catch-all for the combo decks and the other like greedier, slower decks that we're not necessarily angled to beat. And then finally, Agonizing Remorse is just more hand attack. I think Agonizing Remorse is very well positioned as far as hand attack goes because it just exiles the thing and because it has the fail case of hitting something in our opponent's graveyard. This means that, it is going to be very relevant against Storm. It is going to be very relevant against Persist. Having that graveyard option makes it even better against Persist and Storm, against those decks that are trying to like build up their graveyard and eventually pop off with a lot of combo value from their graveyard. So that's the general sentiment on white-black minion mid-range. I think there are decks this deck could struggle with. I think Card Shark is something that's definitely on my radar, and I know people are definitely looking at doing some unfair Card Shark shenanigans. But I think into Persist matchups, I feel like this is going to be a very, very good deck to be on. I think having the removal suite that we do, the interaction that we do, and the sideboard especially, and just the game plan that we're operating on, feel really well positioned against some of the field right now. So it is, I'm ending this at around 11:40, so I will be getting ready to find out if my theory has held true and getting ready to see what the field looks like. So looking forward to round 1, and I will see you there.